You're listening to the Final Say radio show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Sarah Stern, welcome to the Final Say. Sarah Stern, ladies and gentlemen, is the founder and the president of EMET, which is the Endowment for Middle East Truth. Brett and I have had the pleasure of meeting and discussing some of these issues in person with Sarah before, and we invited her on the show because we think she represents a very important perspective, has a lot of experience and a lot of clarity. And again, Sarah, welcome to the Final Say.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Now, Sarah, we really enjoyed meeting you last week down in Washington, D.C. at what I consider to be one of the most important acts that any of us could do, and that is when you actually take the time out to go to Congress and try to educate the people who make such important decisions on the issues such as those which you were discussing. And of course, I'd love for you to discuss and get into a little bit of that today throughout our discussion. But I really, on behalf of John and I, want to thank you for the not just the work, but the hard work and challenging work that you have been doing for a very long time now.
Thank you. I have to do it. It's who I am, but thank you so much.
You're welcome. Now, this is also important for our listeners, for those who are not familiar with EMET. If you could please tell us a little bit about the organization, and feel free, as many times as you'd like, plug the website or whatever you guys are working on so that we may participate and help you guys out.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's great. EMET is an acronym for the Endowment for Middle East Truth. We are an almost 9-year-old think tank and policy shop on Capitol Hill. What we represent is truth, and we are unabashedly pro-Israel and pro-American, and we see no conflict between the two. We see that a strong Israel, which is our only one democratic ally in a very, very turbulent region of the world, which is the Middle East, is probably greater than the most well-equipped aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean in terms of the common struggle of defense of both America and Israel against radical Islam.
Well, that's fantastic, and certainly a wonderful cause and organization. Now, you have recently wrote and published an article in Israel Hayam, and you were dealing with in this article the failure of the United States to prosecute terrorists who have harmed or murdered Americans. And I think this is an incredibly important issue to discuss because we've seen circumstances, even recently, where we watched 5 of the worst, most dangerous people walking the earth released from Guantanamo Bay in exchange for Bo Bergdahl. And I think that's an example of the opposite of prosecuting these types of terrorists.
That's exactly right. I have been involved in this since the signing of the Oslo Accords on September 13th, 1993. And unfortunately, I have recently learned that 58 Americans, when I wrote that article last week, I thought it was only 54, but 58 Americans have been killed as a result of Palestinian terror attacks in Israel or in the Palestinian territories. We do have a 1990 Anti-Terrorism Act that says any time an American has been wounded or killed anywhere around the globe, we have the right to find that suspect, extradite him, indict him, and punish him, have him stand for justice here on these shores. And I unfortunately have a friend, Sherry Mendel, whose 13-year-old son, Kobe, was killed in 2001. And I had been working on a piece of legislation which wanted to take the entire issue of justice for Americans that have been killed anywhere abroad out of the State Department, whose mission, to be fair, is diplomacy, and put it in the Justice Department. And the rationale was that if the name on the door said justice, there would probably be more of a chance of getting a crack at justice that hasn't been contaminated by diplomatic or political factors. So I called up Sherry when she was in her period of mourning for her son Kobe. It's called Sitting Shiva for Jewish people, and I asked her if she would like to have this bill named in memory of Kobe. And she told me, Sarah, I could just see Kobe jumping up and down in heaven to have a law named after him. And I thought to myself, sweetheart, it's a long way before a bill becomes a law. But I knew I wouldn't rest because it gave this grieving mother whose firstborn son was killed in the most horrific way imaginable. He was stoned to death, and his body and that of his Israeli friend Naftali, Yosef Ishran were so badly bludgeoned to death that they needed dental records to identify the bodies. And I told her then, or I made a vow to myself that I would not rest until that bill was signed into law by the President. It took about 4 years, and it was signed into law by President George W. Bush in December of 2004. And in May of 2005, the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism has been opened. So it's been open for 9 years now, and unfortunately, this was a hollow victory when it was opened because they have not done their job, and their job is to bring to justice, to be an advocacy group for any American who's had a loved one wounded or killed. Instead, they have been basically an arm of the State Department, and they've been obfuscating and meeting with family members from time to time and toying with their emotions and saying, we are very, very close to finding the murderer of your son or daughter. Please hold tight. Don't do anything. Don't seek outside counsel. And when they ask where they are in the investigation, they said, we can't tell you because that will compromise an ongoing investigation. So they have been playing with their emotions, and I'm deeply disappointed. I'm deeply disappointed because on the moral level, this is wrong. On the personal level, it's a tragedy. But on a national scale, it is giving a horrible pass to terrorists that have been murdering our American citizens around the globe.
Well, I think that's a really solid, detailed analysis, and there's so many directions we could take this. I want a couple of quick commentaries. One, part of the reason why the State of Israel had gained so much respect early on, some of it was because coming out of the skeletal remains of World War II, of the Holocaust specifically, people saw the Jews as being pathetic, as being weak. Of course, many, including all of the Arab neighbors, saw it simply as a pariah to be destroyed. But many around the world were surprised to see the young nation, with its back constantly against the sea and facing death, not only survive and thrive, but even with its limited resources, it had this moral claim to understanding the importance of punishing the guilty and not allowing people to get away with heinous crimes. And they continued and still continue today to hunt down Nazis wherever and whenever they could. And they went through fairly draconian steps to do that. And I think that speaks volumes. And you fast forward to the event we saw with the 3 teenagers who were abducted and murdered. And I think it's important to note how the entire country came together and felt the pain and wanted to do something about it. And the lack of America stepping up and taking the moral high ground, I think, is an enormous problem.
Yes, I agree with you more. And I think that when Gilad Sher, who is 16 years old, Elad Yifrach, 19, and Naftali Frankel, 16, who happens to be a dual American Israeli citizen, were kidnapped, and over the last several weeks, the entire nation of Israel felt like one people with one heart. We were constantly, and I'm speaking of the Jewish people and good citizens all over the world. We're constantly awaiting news, and we feel by now that there has hardly been a family member who has not been touched in one way or another by Palestinian terrorism. And although Israel has always, up until the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, projected strength, I think something happened, and something happened during the first Intifada, which broke out in 1987, and that was when the Israeli soldier, when they saw stones being lifted by children, they didn't know how to deal with this, because it has always been a regnant part of Israeli philosophy that Israel fight moral wars and defensive wars. And here they just saw this intifada, or this uprising of children, and they did not know what to do with that. And this has been extremely problematic for Israel, because they wanted to deal with him as we would deal with Westerners, as we would deal with Canadians or Mexicans, and the Israelis had really predicated all of the Oslo Accords and all of the subsequent agreements on two people wanting to divide the pie. Well, unfortunately, from the beginning, and it's been 20 years now, the Palestinian Authority, from the very top down, has been teaching their children to become suicide bombers, has been praising a cult of death, and has basically been teaching all of their people that one day all of Israel will be theirs, from Haifa in the north to Eilat in the south, and from the Mediterranean River, and from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is much, much greater than Israel. So I feel this is in order for a peace process to work, both parties have to share in the objective of peace. And unfortunately, we've only had one party that's really wanted to divide the pie, and the other that's been teaching their people from day one to hang on. One day all of this is going to be theirs.
Now, I think you raise another brilliant point here. It's one of the biggest problems that I have with the West, but also that Israel has with the Palestinians, who, quite frankly, have strategically played a far more intelligent game. And this is the game of moral relativism. So I want to point out something very briefly to our audience. Just look at today. We had, sadly, a Palestinian youth, teenager of similar age, was murdered. I haven't seen final reports yet. Israel is investigating. We don't know yet. It looks like it may very well be a crime of vengeance against the other three teams, but or it could be a normal crime. We don't know for sure, but let's look at the difference between the societies. As you pointed out, the moral relativism immediately silenced, instead of the world feeling sorry for Israel, it was like, well, see, of course they're killing your teens, because that's what you do. You kill teens. But here's the difference. Israel immediately, for example, has already imprisoned IDF soldiers, not because they took part in that crime, simply because, in violation of military rules of conduct, they had posted on social media words that called for vengeance. Just simply calling for vengeance was enough to land them in jail. Flip to the Palestinian side of the equation, and I know you follow memory closely as part of your own research, and Memory just put out today and of course that's Middle East Media Research Institute, that the Palestinians are telling their people that this was part of the ritual process of the age-old anti-Semitic ritual, claiming that Jews kill the youth of their enemies and then take their blood and make matzah. You look at that and then you try to equate this to fighting a war when society treats uses this moral relativism where Israel is somehow supposed to be treated the exact same way and have the exact same restraint we expect from a terrorist society as we do from, as you so aptly called it, our democratic aircraft carrier standing alone in the Middle East in a sea of radicalism.
Right. You pointed to something wonderful. You hit the nail on the head, the moral relativism. I was waiting and watching the major network news for the 18 days during the hunt for where these boys were, and there was hardly a word about it. However, on CBS News last night, there was a huge story about the unfortunate, tragic death of this young Arab boy, which is being investigated from the very top down. And as you say, if there even are people that post Facebook postings within the IDF for vengeance, they are court-martialed and they have to go to military prison. There is a very different kind of society where people who are in charge of the Palestinian Authority media were bragging about these three boys. They had at the Fatah website had a picture of a fishing rod and 3 mice that they caught with their names on it. And this is there's absolutely no comparison between a society with the rule of law and a society that is teaching people to worship suicide and death.
No, that's absolutely correct. And, I want to bring up two things that I noticed in doing some research yesterday. One is that I noticed several of the major networks via their social media putting out either tweets or stories talking about the fact that North Korea had just launched test-launched 2 missiles.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we're supposed to be concerned about that as if that's nothing new. But there's something else that happens on a daily basis, and that's missiles and rockets being launched from Gaza and other places into Israel on a daily basis. So my response in social media was, it would be nice if you reported the more significant problem, and that is the country that has a large portion of their population who live in fear of constant attack, to the point where sometimes you have sirens that go off where you have to run for a bomb shelter or a shelter. What about in school when you're afraid that your school is going to have a rocket fall into it, or the local store, the grocery store, the bus stop, you name it. It's a horrible. I mean, Israel's a wonderful place, but it's a terrible thing to have to live in that type of fear. And I think the media is complicit, but the way they go about reporting and really playing one side of the story. And it is kind of shameful. Now, here's another problem. I also noticed a lot of the countries in Europe who are having these test votes or were actually voting to divest themselves of doing business in what they call the green zone, or certain borders that exist within Israel. And I really find it hard to believe, being that almost every one of these countries in Europe, not only did they go back a long time ago, they experienced the Crusades and all the battles that have gone on historically throughout Europe, but they have also experienced the same type of terrorism that us as Americans and certainly the Israelis have. And I just don't understand how you could bury your head in the sand to the point where you will actually, and I will call it this, aid and abet the enemy in furthering their position at the detriment of your ally. I mean, I really just don't understand what's going on. And I'm sure you don't either, but
I don't either, although I do think that there is, even we have 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Most of them are peaceful. Most of them, I think, go to the mosque, just like many Jews go to their synagogue on the Sabbath. They don't even understand the words that we're saying, even if the words are violent. But even if just 10% of 1.5 billion Muslims do understand the words and the exhortations to kill Jews and Christians, then we have a big problem on our hands. And I think the world, if you look at the United Nations, it's like the Muslims are the bullies in the playground. There are 57 nations that are part of the OIC, the Organization for the Islamic Conference now. It used to be Cooperation. And that's the biggest voting bloc within the United Nations. And all the unallied nations vote together with the OIC. Places like Cuba and Venezuela vote with them. So we're looking, there's not an international arena that's free from these sorts of bully tactics. And I know a lot of people nowadays are going to these institutions of international jurisdiction like the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice in The Hague as the final arbitrators. But these institutions have become like thugocracies. So we have a very, very huge problem. When you also mentioned what happened with the Gaza withdrawal, I have to tell you, I was in Israel in 2005 before the Gaza withdrawal, and I saw how heart-wrenching and internally divisive this was. And I remember the people on the left and many of my friends in AIPAC were telling me, you know, this will finally prove to the world once and for all how far Israel is willing to go for peace, even without a real negotiating partner. And Israeli Jewish millionaires spent lots and lots of money for greenhouses, and they wanted to, so that the nascent Palestinian state would have an economic infrastructure. And there were rabbis saying we should keep the synagogues because, after all, we all pray to the same God, you know, and they can turn them into mosques. The minute that the blue and white Israeli flag was lowered and the last member of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, left and turned the key in the gate, they destroyed those greenhouses and those synagogues in a hate-infested, nihilistic carnival of anarchy. And unfortunately, the people in southern Israel have barely gotten a let-up in terms of the Qassam rocket missiles going in. In fact, even this morning, there was a Qassam rocket missile that hit a kindergarten. Thank God it hit the kindergarten. They're having summer camp there now, and it hit the kindergarten before the children arrived. But this is very, very frightening, and people don't want to be reminded of this. They just don't want to know. I think it's very Western and very American to project our good intentions upon the rest of the world and to think they're a little wrong and they're a little wrong, and the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But sometimes there is a force of good there, and sometimes there's a force of evil, and we really have to recognize that.
That's absolutely right. Well, Sarah Stern, thank you so much for joining us, and unfortunately we're out of time, but we certainly want to have you come back. If you can, please provide the website for your organization.
Oh, thank you so much. Right, thank you so much.
Anything else that you have about 30 seconds. Thank you.
Okay, we're a very poor organization. We would love any support. Our website is www.EMET, E as in Edward, M as in Mary, E as in Edward, T as in Thomas. It's one word, EMET Online. That's one word, emetonline.org.
Excellent. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Anytime. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.